doctors. I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff of QME Continuing Education, and welcome to this week's presentation. Last time we were together, we reviewed a special report that was initiated by the Commission on Health and Safety and Workers' Compensation that studied the overall effectiveness of Senate Bill 542 that was passed in 2019. Now, that bill made a workers' compensation claim made by a firefighter or a peace officer easier to file due to a claim of PTSD. However, their study revealed that this bill actually was placing a large financial burden on the California workers' compensation system with less than stellar results. Thus, they're deliberating whether or not to allow this bill to sunset in January of 25. Now, today we continue this special report as we focus on the firefighters and as we investigate the prevalence of claiming musculoskeletal disorders among firefighters in California. This has led to a considerable amount of interest among policymakers about how to best monitor, prevent, and treat these musculoskeletal disorders among firefighters. So, what they find out? Let's take a look. First, these are the following sources that I referenced when producing this presentation. Feel free to copy and paste these links into your browser if you'd like to read more about this special report. First, we know firefighters play a vital role in protecting the public, often placing their own lives at risk in order to protect the health and the safety of others. Firefighting is one of the most dangerous occupations in the United States in terms of a workplace injury risk. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that approximately 508 non-fatal injuries per 10,000 full-time firefighters in 2017. Now, this is more than 5 times the rate of an injury per 10,000 of full-time employees that workers face on average in the private sector, which is only 89.4 per 10,000. In California, the risks of firefighting have become even more striking in the past few years, with the record wildfires and resulting deaths. Now, the health risks facing firefighters go beyond burns, automobile crashes, and other acute trauma. Firefighters are widely believed to face an elevated risk of cancer due to smoke inhalation and exposure to other hazardous materials. Additionally, the strenuous nature of the work and its rigorous physical demands can actually take a big physical toll, including wear and tear that increases the risks of back injury, joint pain, or other forms of musculoskeletal disorders, particularly for older workers. As in most occupations, the firefighter is the most common type of occupational injury or illness is the musculoskeletal disorder, which creates a concern that the strenuous physical demands of firefighting could put workers at a greater risk of work loss and disability. Moreover, rigorous job requirements that dictate that even a relatively minor work restriction prevents firefighters from performing the full range of activities that are required of them to remain on active duty. Thus, the risk of these musculoskeletal disorders injuries can make it more difficult and costly to maintain fully staffed fire departments capable of protecting the public at an optimal level. This has led to a considerable interest in the policymakers and the stakeholders on how to best monitor, prevent, and treat these musculoskeletal disorders among firefighters. Now, a 2010 study by the RAND Corporation compared the frequency and economic consequences of work-related musculoskeletal disorders among the firefighters to those of other workers in the public and private sectors. This study found that firefighters experience these musculoskeletal disorders at a significantly higher rate than other workers, even those in other high-risk jobs such as police or corrections work. Moreover, the firefighters were more likely than other workers to experience lost time because of these musculoskeletal disorders when they're older. However, the study also found that the economic impact of these disorders, back injuries in particular, was more moderate on average for firefighters than for other employees. So in the 2020 study, RAND updated the analyses from the 2010 study and considered the impacts of the Senate Bill 863, workers' compensation reforms, and economic shocks of the late 2000s on outcomes for firefighters with musculoskeletal disorders compared to other injured workers. So there were 5 study objectives that they tried to assess in this study. First of all, they wanted to characterize the recent trends in musculoskeletal disorder claims rates and the case mix among the firefighters. They also wanted to describe the economic consequences of these musculoskeletal disorders. They wanted to estimate the prevalence of psychiatric comorbidities among the firefighters with these disorders, and also wanted to estimate the effects of the disability rating reforms enacted in Senate Bill 863. Now, I mentioned that earlier in an earlier slide, but as you may recall, Senate Bill 863 was passed in 2012, and it was signed into law by Governor Brown. The bill made wide-ranging changes to California's workers' compensation system, including increased benefits to injured workers and cost-saving efficiencies. And then the last one that they tried to assess here was the effects of the caps that this bill placed on chiropractic, occupational therapy, and physical medicine visits. So what were their findings? Well, first of all, they found that firefighter injury rates are actually high compared to other workers. Between 2005 and 2017, the firefighter injury rate ranged from just under 200 per thousand workers to more than 250 per thousand workers. Injury rates for police officers are similarly, though slightly lower, while the overall rate for overall worker ranges were from 35 to 50 per thousand versus 250 per thousand for firefighters. Substantially different. And while the rate of occupational injuries throughout the United States labor force has actually declined steadily, they have found no discernible trend for firefighters or police officers. Firefighters also have the highest share of injuries that of musculoskeletal in nature, with 47% of those injuries involving musculoskeletal disorders, compared to 38% for police officers, and 42% for other public sector workers, and 37% in the private sector comparison group with similar job requirements to firefighters. And finally, they had a 42% for other private sector workers. So this confirms that these musculoskeletal disorders are a particular source of concern for firefighters. Now, firefighters also have an elevated risk of musculoskeletal disorders across their full life cycle, with over half of the firefighter injuries at ages between 40 to 49 years old involving these musculoskeletal disorders. By comparison, just 39% of the injuries in the private sector comparison group involved musculoskeletal disorders. Now, compared to other occupations, the injuries to firefighters are actually less likely to involve upper extremities and significantly more likely to involve lower extremities or the trunk. Strains are the modal cause of injury for firefighters. Burns are significantly more common among firefighters than other workers, obviously, but still represent a small share of the injuries. Only 6% of the injuries were burn injuries in comparison to the high number for musculoskeletal disorders. Now, they also assessed earning losses, and they found that for firefighters, earning losses worsened after the recession of 2008 and 9, but the consequences of the musculoskeletal disorders for firefighters were actually less severe than for workers in similar occupations. They also examined post-injury earnings and employment for firefighters using methods developed in a previous RAND study to compare injured worker outcomes to a control group of similar workers without an injury. In the second year after injury, injured firefighters earned 95% of what they would have earned in the absence of the injury. As in our 2010 study, firefighters with musculoskeletal disorders appear to have less severe economic consequences from their injuries than do workers in similar occupations. Now, post-injury earnings in the second year after injury were sharply lower in comparable occupations, 88th percentile for police, 85% for other public sector workers, and 87% for private sector workers. These differences in earnings are mirrored closely by the differences in the proportion of injured workers who continue to work for the employer where the injury had occurred, or the at injury employer. Fire departments appear to do a better job than other employers, even in public sector employers, at retaining their injured workers. Now, when we consider disability benefits, they find that based on the standard ratings, firefighters with permanently disabling musculoskeletal disorders who were rated at the California Disability Evaluation Unit, or the DEU as we know it, appeared to have similar impairment severity to the police and other comparison occupations with the same type of rating. Firefighters had slightly higher final ratings than comparable occupations prior to Senate Bill 863. Firefighters have relatively high occupational adjustments, and their slightly older age at their injury may also result in a more favorable adjustments under the current disability rating schedule. Other aspects in the rating process, such as frequency with which apportionment is recommended and the use of alternative rating procedures, were not dramatically different between the firefighters and other occupations. Now, the implementation of Senate Bill 863 was followed by higher final ratings for firefighters with musculoskeletal disorders who received a summary rating typically performed for workers without legal representation at the request of a workers' compensation judge. The only provision of State Bill or Senate Bill 863 that would tend to reduce the ratings was the elimination of psychiatric add-on impairments. And we saw that psychiatric add-on impairments were rated in fewer than 1 in 100 musculoskeletal disorders cases for firefighters prior to the Senate Bill 863. Now, they also examined the diagnosis codes for medical services and prescriptions billed to workers' compensation to identify musculoskeletal disorder injuries with comorbid psychiatric conditions. This data indicate that the firefighters and police have similar rates of psychiatric comorbidities, but the incidence rates of public safety workers are substantially lower than rates observed among other public sector workers or comparable private sector workers. They found that evidence that psychiatric comorbidities are actually associated with worse labor market outcomes as compared to musculoskeletal disorders without such comorbidities. Now, taken together, these findings don't provide evidence that a post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, or other psychiatric comorbidities are a more serious concern for firefighters than other workers in other similar occupations. Now, the findings on treatment caps are a little surprising, in my opinion. But first, we understand that the workers' compensation system is designed to provide injured workers with necessary medical care. There was a concern among stakeholders that some of the policies that were used to control the costs actually interfered with the workers' ability to access the needed care. Senate Bill 228, which was enacted in 2003, actually sought to control the medical spending growth through a number of policy levers, including establishment of treatment caps on chiropractic and physical medicine to 24 visits. They asked, well, what proportion of the workers with and without musculoskeletal disorders have sufficiently high utilization of the CAP services to potentially be affected by the caps, and whether they saw a larger than expected number of workers stopping treatment when they reached the cap. Believe it or not, they did not find clear evidence that Senate Bill 228 treatment caps posed a particularly strong barrier to the receipt of the types of care subject to the cap. So, what are some policy implications as a result of this study? Well, they found that the disability ratings indicated that Senate Bill 863 has actually been effective in raising final ratings and statutory benefits for both firefighters and for the comparable groups of workers. The rating changes and the increase in the statutory maximum in Senate Bill 863, they say appears to have been particularly favorable for firefighters as well, likely due to the high proportion of the firefighters who earn above the pre-Senate Bill 863 maximum weekly wage, and due to the frequency of knee impairments, which received the second largest possible increase in final ratings from changes to the formula used to calculate ratings. They did, however, notice that there was an uptick in the frequency in which apportionment was recommended on those consult ratings. Finally, they were concerned about the impact of mental health stigma on the analysis of PTSD and the psychiatric comorbidities, where somewhat different methods and additional data collection are going to be necessary to understand their implications, and the findings of these public safety workers are far less likely to receive treatment for psychiatric conditions in the workers' compensation system. So, this week's installment actually set out to answer 5 specific questions involving firefighters' workers' compensation claims. Now, as you learned today, these questions were addressed, but they raised many more concerns regarding the injuries that firefighters sustain in California, both emotionally, PTSD, and physically, with essentially musculoskeletal disorders. Now, with the number of wildfires in California increasing every year, these concerns will continue to grow for those who choose this very demanding occupation of firefighting. Let's hope that the information gained from this special report will prompt legislators to address these concerns and these trends that we see as it comes to the health of the firefighters in California. So, doctors, I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff, and I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to join me in this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I do look forward to sharing other interesting subjects as they relate to the workers' compensation system in the state of California. Until next time.